Yo, yo, we are here. Another episode of Mobile Homies. Another episode of Mobile Homies. Live with my man Bao Nguyen. What up, Matt? What up, Matty? Let's see if Bao's in yet. Welcome to another episode of Mobile Homies with Bao Nguyen. He'll be with us any minute now. Hope everybody's doing good. Yeah. Bao, there he is. Hold on a minute.
Hey
What?
man, what's up?
How you doing?
I'm good.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay, good, good.
Where are you?
I'm in LA right now.
You're in LA.
I'm in
Okay.
LA, yeah.
Right.
I moved to LA like in the middle of the pandemic.
Right. I remember. Yeah,
Yeah.
I remember. Well, I want to say for everybody out there, welcome to another episode of Mobile Homies. This is an Instagram Live version episode. My guy, Bao Nguyen, who has done so much important work. But today we're going to talk about the ESPN doc, Beat Water, of course, on Bruce Lee. Welcome, man.
Yeah, I know. Thanks for having me, man. It's been a bit of a crazy week, or yeah, it's been only a week since I came out, but it seems like so long ago.
Man, have you just been slammed and inundated with press and et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, it's been crazy because we've gotten like more press requests after the film aired, which is strange
Right.
because usually you're supposed to be like leading up to the premiere, but it's gotten such a great reception that people have been trying to do interviews, but also like I have like friends from high school that I haven't talked to and since high school that are like, oh man, that I knew Bao Nguyen and all that type of stuff, uh,
Right.
and no, it's been really. I'm so grateful for the response, especially from the community, like the Asian American community. Like they've
Yeah.
really like shown up and turned up for the film.
I noticed that. I saw like a lot of our mutual friends chimed in and had really great things to say about it. I think for me, um, it's interesting because I mean, I've been following your career for a while because of our mutual friend, Jeff Chang, who's obviously a Quantum slash Soul Side's founding member and alumni. And I first I think I first saw your work. It was the We Gonna Be All Right series with Jeff. And obviously, so shout to Jeff out there. Shout to Jeff Chang out there.
Yeah. And he's the one who says Hollywood's racist because America's racist in the film in Be Water. So people
That
love that line. We should make him wear a shirt that says that.
that was the quote. That was the quote, and we can get into that in a second. But let me ask you this. I mean, what was the impetus for this?
Um, I, I think every Asian American boy they see Bruce Lee and I shouldn't say every, but for me, I wasn't used to seeing myself on screen, right, in a positive way. I'd see myself as like the sidekick or as the villain or something like that. So when I saw Enter the Dragon, I was born 10 years after it came out, so I saw it like in syndication on Saturday afternoon or something.
Mm-hmm.
It just blew my mind because I finally saw someone who look relatively like me. I shouldn't say, I don't look like Bruce Lee. I wish I looked like Bruce Lee.
Right.
But that look like me, and he was the hero. He's the leading man of this film, of a feature film. And he's
Yeah.
like kicking everyone's ass, and so that always like stuck in my mind of Bruce Lee being the symbol for Asian American representation, for being a hero. And I realized though, like as I got older, I just knew him as the myth, right? The icon Bruce Lee. I
Right.
didn't know who he was as a person.
Yeah.
And surely he had to go through a lot of struggle, like prejudice, being an Asian American male in the 1960s, and trying to make it in Hollywood. So I really wanted to sort of unpack that myth um, with this film.
And where did you grow up? Where were you when you were watching these Bruce Lee movies?
I grew up right outside Washington, D.C., in this city called Silver Spring, Maryland,
Okay, right.
right
Yeah.
outside. And I was very fortunate because it's a very diverse city. It's considered like one of the top 10 most diverse cities under like 200,000 people. So I had friends that were African American, the Latinx, Asian Americans, not just Asian Americans, but like Asian immigrants who had just come over to
Right.
America. And so that helped inform the way I thought about other people, just like Bruce did too. I think that, his days in Seattle when he, his first couple years in America, first few years in America, um, being around people like Jesse Glover, Taki, Leroy, he had a very multicultural community that taught him about America. And I think that's important for sure.
Well, one of the things that I wanted to touch upon with you is that, myself growing up, I think I think I'm a bit older than you are, but one of the things that I realized is that I didn't become acquainted with Bruce Lee movies until like 10 years after his death either. And I think, and like yourself, I mean, when I was growing up in California, Kung Fu movies they were a Saturday afternoon thing on like local television, like there was Kung Fu theater and all. And a lot of that I see now was obviously inspired by the success of Bruce Lee movies, that the fact that these could even be aired on the weekends on the local network affiliates. But for me, I always kind of had sort of a love-hate relationship with Bruce Lee, because, and we can unpack this in a bit, because I know a lot of people kind of felt this way, is that while he was our icon and our representation, I personally kind of resented the fact that all people thought about us so that we were kung fu masters, you know what I mean? And that was a big issue for me growing up, in the 80s, is like that, also at the time it was all about wax on, wax off. And, the assumption was that we all knew martial arts. But then as I got older, I see how difficult his journey was. And this was his end. This was our end. This wasn't the final destination, but this was our end. And I mean, did you have feelings like that growing up, or did you encounter that with other people growing up, that we were held to a kind of a one-dimensional standard?
For sure. I think I tried to use it to my advantage as much as I could. When I got in a scuffle with people, I just like get in some sort of stance. Even though at the time I didn't know anything, and people would just be like backing up a bit. But it's as a community, as any community, we shouldn't be seen as a monolith. We shouldn't be seen in one way. There's multifacets to all communities and all individuals.
Right.
And I can understand totally that you don't want to just be seen as a kung fu guy, right? And I mean, sadly, my parents made me do kung fu too, and I was so sick of it. After a year, I didn't do it. So I think I had the worst of everything, because I didn't even do it long enough, but I still had the stereotype that I did it.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, the interesting thing about Bruce is that he didn't want to just be seen. Even himself didn't want to be seen just as the kung fu guy. He dreamt of being the leading man, the playing in a drama, and I think it just comes to show you how like myopic Hollywood can be in shaping narratives and stories. And you know, for the longest time, like Jackie Chan, Jet Li have been the Asian view of, of, of things. And I mean, it's funny. I was in like South Africa like 5 years ago when like the Gangnam Style was coming out, when Psy was huge.
Right.
And a bunch of South African kids just ran up to me and started doing Gangnam Style, the dance, and just called me Psy. And I was like, I guess that's progress. That I'm not like, they're not doing the kung fu moves. They're doing like
Right.
Gangnam Style. I didn't know what to make of it because it was so, it just surprised me so much. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what I understand now, and especially after watching Be Water, after watching the doc, what I understand now is Bruce was the beginning. You know what I mean? It's not the end, it's the beginning, and I think that was what I had the most issue with growing up, because I saw how I knew how complex we were. I knew how rich and diverse we were. I knew how varied we were. And yet we only had this one image, to focus on. The world only had this single image to focus on. But now, as I've gotten older, and I'm sure like yourself, I mean, you know, as Asians in this business, I totally relate to all the struggles that he had to go through, and everything that he had to endure. I mean, he was almost like our Sammy Davis Jr., you know what I mean? Like everything that he had to go through in showbiz. And I noticed, just reading through your Instagram, how you were able to go through his daily planner and all his notes and his journal. Was there anything in there that sort of documented what was happening in his mind, or anything that documented his struggle as he was moving through his daily life in the biz?
I mean, a lot of it was, especially like in the later years, he had to teach kung fu a lot to like these white actors because he wasn't getting the jobs that he was auditioning for, just jobs that he felt were not stereotypical of being Chinese. And he was, I mean, he had that principle that many of us don't have the kind of the liberty, right? The freedom to like say no to a job. I don't, joan on any type of actor who takes on a role that might be stereotypical, because they're at least trying to bring themselves into it a bit, right? Like, and so he filled his days like, yeah, teaching a lot to like Steve McQueen. Like, it's just funny saying like 10 a.m. Class with Steve McQueen, and then the next day is like 11 a.m. with like Kareem or something, and I was like, oh my god, this is like touching history. But what I mean, from reading his like letters and his writings, he just worked so hard. It was just crazy how focused he was, and he would just like, it made me feel really lazy watching reading these things, because it's like
Right.
he like quarters out his day by the hour, and just how much he packs in a day, but also how meticulous he was in terms of his editing. Like he would edit like crazy. Like all these letters that he would send out, they would be like the seventh draft of a letter. You'd see him write and cross, write out the second draft, and it's just like all the self editing, and it makes you think like,
What kind of letters? What kind of letters are you talking about?
like letters to Linda when he's like abroad or something, or like letters back home to friends in Hong Kong, things like that. And even just like really what would feel like banal letters, like just talking about, oh, this is what I did, this week. He would edit, and he would be very careful.
So when you see him doing that kind of editing, just for, when it's like that banal everyday letters, I mean, what did that tell you about his personality?
That he always was kind of self-improving himself, right? And I think that kind of, you see that in his philosophy, you see that in the idea of like Jeet Kune Do too, just always kind of focusing on the individual, right? And yeah, I mean, it made you think like you're always trying to perfect yourself into something greater, and like there you saw the ambition in Bruce Lee, and that's one of the things I want to do with the film too. Is that when we think of Bruce Lee, we think of like almost like a mythical godlike person, or not a person, I should say, but just like a myth. And I wanted for us to relate to him as a person and see all his flaws and vulnerabilities and how we connect to those different aspects of being human, because I think for too long he's been seen as someone who's like untouchable, and he's not.
I think that, you know, when I hear you talk about him writing his letters like that, I mean, it just sort of speaks to the meticulousness also, and the attentiveness to detail. And it seemed like a guy who was really self-aware. And do you get the impression that he kind of understood where he stood in the world, you know, as a relate to showbiz, or his where he was at that moment in history? Do you get the impression that he had this understanding of like this 360-degree understanding of where he actually was in?
I don't think so, because I think the 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 motto of be water or be like water is definitely not just kind of that, like he lived that in his life and the way he interacted with people. And he always thought that he could somehow kind of move around things, flow around things. And these systems that were set in place, these traditions, these systems of rigidity, they were always going to change, right? So he saw the world as fluid, not just himself. And I think that's why he was able to succeed in many ways. Because if you kind of know your place in the world and someone is telling you where your place is,
Mm-hmm.
and that kind of creates a stagnation in many ways. And like when he's rejected for the lead in kung fu, and people say, "Oh, America's not ready for an Asian hero." He doesn't want to hear that as his place. He wants to like kind of figure out how he can be the Asian hero, and that meant going to Hong Kong, right? And then coming back, hopefully coming back eventually.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting that you know, he tried very hard, and you know, obviously he landed the role of Kato, and he was teaching and so forth, but he felt like he had to go back to Hong Kong. Well, he did go back to Hong Kong, succeeded, became a huge star, and the perception of him when he came back was that he was already a huge star in America, right? I mean, is that accurate?
That's what I mean, because they were used to like seeing. Um, they had never seen like an Asian be in a kind of Hollywood production.
Right.
I think the television network in Hong Kong had packaged it as a Kato show, right? It wasn't the Green Hornet, so they literally made him the hero, and that it's all perception. The world is just about perception, and
Right.
so by making him the hero, it made it easier for him to succeed in Hong Kong. I
And
think if he was packaged as the failure of like Green Hornet got canceled and all that, then
well, that's what's interesting within the Asian American community. I think, especially in showbiz, is that you know, we're so juiced and we're so stoked to see ourselves on camera. It almost, I mean, on the screen, it doesn't even matter what the ratings are. You know what I mean? Like, we just get so psyched just to have presence, you know, like, look at us now when we saw Jeremy Lin, you know what I mean? It was like, just to see a dude on the court playing with superstars on TV. He didn't have to be an all-star. He didn't have to be a champion. He didn't have to, he didn't have to be Michael Jordan. Just his very presence, was enough to motivate us to go buy tickets or to watch, or it's like, I was talking to Kimmy Yam about this, and for us, watching Fresh Off the Boat, or any number of roles or sitcoms that we see ourselves in, it doesn't have to be Friends or at the level of Seinfeld. Just our very presence. on screen is enough for us to get motivated to show up, you know.
Sure.
And you know, that's kind of what I thought when I saw, like you said, how he had been packaged as a, you know, a star back when he went to Hong Kong. But then at the same time, I forget what was the term. I forget what he was called. He was considered,
Mid Pacific man.
what was it?
Mid
Mid,
Pacific man.
right. That was really interesting to me. You know, is a guy that was kind of in between. You know,
Exactly. I
how,
think, I mean, before we get into the Mid Pacific man, you know, a mutual friend of ours, Randall Park, when he was talking about Bruce Lee, he's like, yeah, he saw like an Asian hero and like that he could do anything. He's like, that's how white people must feel all the time because they see themselves in everything. And
right?
that's why I think representation is so important. And
Yeah.
it's not just a trend. It's like, yeah, visibility. It's like feeling that that you're present in this world. And I mean, going to like the Mid Pacific man, I think that's something too. As people, hyphenated Americans, we all feel like we're in between. The idea of being in between, and you don't think of Bruce Lee feeling that way. You don't think that when he comes to uh, any place, you just he's you know, people own Bruce Lee so much. Like Hong Kong owns him, America owns him. He transcends race to many people. Like you have
Yeah.
to remember, like he wears his race on his face. He's Asian American, and you know, in Hong Kong, he was seen as Asian American, as American, and he was trying to find his place between the two worlds of the East and the West. And I wanted to include that line to make sure, like, he didn't have it easy even when he was a big star in Hong Kong.
Yeah. And then also at that time, he was in an interracial marriage, you know, which highly unusual at that time, especially people don't understand the nuance of this. But what was even more unusual is that here you have this Asian man with a white woman, you know, and that in its even today, that's unusual. But 50 years ago, it was interesting hearing Linda talking about how she would walk into stores in Hong Kong and she could hear the clerks and the vendors talking about her in Chinese, you know, like saying bad things about her, but she could understand.
Yeah.
Um, that had to add a whole nother layer of challenge for him in both countries, I would think, you know.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think Linda's parents were not approving at first of the relationship, and you know, you think of someone like Bruce Lee, who's like kind of the perfect person to bring home in many aspects, and it just shows you like the systems and the ideas that are planted in our society for centuries. And that's why, for me, it was really important to include the conversation about like the Chinese coming over, building the railroads, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the model minority myth, because to understand like why someone like Bruce Lee is rejected in Hollywood and why he can't play the hero, you have to understand like all these policies, all these examples of like systemic racism and bias that have come before to form this idea of the Asian American male.
I'm not even sure if, I mean, I don't know the exact dates, but I'm not even sure if when they were dating at that time, it was even legal for them to be married in
It was
America.
legal in Washington State, but not in many other places. Yeah.
So where they were married in when they were married in Washington State, that was one of the few states in America where it was legal to marriage
Yeah.
interracially.
That's what Loving versus Virginia is 67, right?
1967,
Yeah.
right? And the reason why I relate to that is because, you know, my father is Japanese, my mother is white. They met around that time as well, you know, and they were divorced when I was very young. But you, like you said, to put it in historical context, I mean, they were together at a time where in a lot of states that was just illegal, you know. I mean, very interesting time. So he just went against convention. You know, they went against convention the entire time, it seemed like, you know. The
Yeah.
other, the other thing you talk about is, you know, one of the reasons why he was such a transcendent figure, it seems, is that he appealed to so many different ethnic groups, and he crossed color lines. I mean, I remember growing up, a lot of my friends, my non-Asian friends, particularly my non-Asian friends of color, huge Bruce Lee fans, huge, you know. How do you explain that?
I think it's just kind of the message of his films, right? The idea of like him being the underdog fighting against the oppressed, especially like in his first couple of films,
Hmm.
Big Boss, Fist of Fury. Like in the Big Boss, he's like fighting on the side of like workers, and then in Fist of Fury, he's like fighting against colonialism. And you know, and obviously like his death, his early death, has immortalized him. He's become like elemental in many ways, and
Mm.
because he's become elemental, people can project a lot of their um, experiences onto Bruce and his story, and especially like in the 1970s. And you think of like where these movies were playing, and they were playing like in Chinatown, and then like places like Harlem, and they were playing, you know, alongside like black exploitation films, and then you have like a double feature of Bruce Lee. So you have, it's just this kind of culmination of a lot of different things that happened. I
Right.
don't think Bruce would have imagined himself being a hero for the African American communities in the way that he has. But I do think it it's not necessarily by coincidence, it's not by design, but it's, you know, his relationships with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Kareem taught him about black liberation and the civil rights movement, and just like kind of also third world solidarity
Right.
that informed the movies that he would make. So like those themes and those topics, if they're not necessarily directly affecting the African American community, there's like this kind of osmosis because, you know, Kareem influencing the storylines, the plot of these films. You know, Jim Kelly too. You know, in Enter the Dragon, kind of one of the first times you see an African American. You know, he's like beating up police in the opening scenes, which is very timely now. So you have like, that's like, I see it's like this real like authentic solidarity between like Asian and African American communities, and Bruce. I think now, even today, it's been crazy because obviously there's so much going on in America
Right.
with police brutality, systemic racism, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others. It's weird for me to be talking about my film, but I've gotten so many messages from people, especially people in the African American community, saying, you know, I needed your film as just like a breather and just like a moment of inspiration. And I feel like that, just like that type of response is something I could never anticipate. And I feel, again, really grateful, and I'm glad that people have reached out to me and told me that, because part of me, it's like, feels a little bit of like out of the moment of like not engaging as much as I can because I'm talking about the film. But if story, if culture, if like film can inspire people, then I'm I'm very privileged to be in the position to tell these type of stories that are inspiring.
I think that that's absolutely true right now, and I think you know, one of the things that, again, that I understand now about him that I didn't understand before, and what made him so transcendent and so important is he really identified with the struggle of people of color, most notably, like you said, black people. You know what I mean? I mean, his link with Kareem, when you talk about you know, sort of the way that Kareem viewed the world, obviously, you know, and you got to think also at that time in the early '70s, there weren't a lot of black people in movies either. You know what I mean? So especially big movies. So to have Jim Kelly in a movie, to have Kareem in a movie, and I just remember as a kid watching Jim Kelly, right? And I saw some of Jim Kelly's other movies too growing up, you know, and I'm like, this is the coolest motherfucker I have seen. You know what I mean? And you see Kareem in there in Game of Death with the glasses, you know, and you see, you know, Jim Kelly had his own style and everything. And it was, they were beautiful portrayals of people. You know, they were very positive portrayals of people. And you could tell that Bruce did that respectfully. And when you see how in the movie, when you talk about he called Kareem up, he's like, look, man, I don't have any money right now, man. But
Let me keep it 100 with you. Yeah.
look, I don't have the money, man, but we're, you know, we're going to shoot this movie anyway. Let's see what happens. And Kareem was like, I'm down. That says everything. You know, it really says everything about the mutual respect that they have for each other. And I think that concept, like you said, I mean, it translates to now. You know, when you see how much solidarity there is right now, when you see the meme, you know, yellow peril and black power, you know, like that's something I felt my whole life growing up. All my heroes were black, you know what I mean, growing up, every single one of them, you know, because that's all I had, you know. And now that I see the way that Bruce was, we share that, you know, we share that in common, I think, you know.
I mean, I think it's his early years in America that, again, were really formative. When he met Jesse Glover, his first student, who was African American, was a victim of police brutality, actually. And so that really made Bruce think of like what it meant to be different in America in many ways, and how he was going to approach America. And I think, you know, it was an indirect theme of the film. It was like, we need to have communities that are multicultural, that are inclusive, that are diverse. And, you know, these ideas of very like homogeneous neighborhoods and people telling us to go back to our country type of thing, like not, that's not the America that my parents, you know, came over to from Vietnam. Like, and that's not the America that made Bruce Lee. Like, if you want more Bruce Lees in the world, then we need to kind of come together.
Yeah. Well, you saw that in his teaching strategy too. He didn't turn anybody away. You know, I mean, he didn't have very rigid ideas about who was deserving of instruction. You know, he was very open in that regard.
Yeah, I think he learned that too in his time in Hong Kong because his mom had European blood in her, so he was never viewed, even early in his life, his upbringing in Hong Kong, he was never viewed as like 100% Chinese. So he always faced that discrimination and that, yeah, feeling like an outsider. So that really informed. He had to struggle with that his whole life, and I think that kind of empowered him.
You mean he had to struggle with that his mother was Hapa, like he was not pure.
Yeah, like like other students like in his schools were like, oh, you're not 100% Chinese, or like, you know, even when he started being taught by Yip Man, the other students were like, oh, why are we teaching this guy? He's not like pure Chinese.
That's really interesting, man. That's really interesting. So when you think about it today, I mean, his story is very modern, you know, because he had to struggle with a lot of things, you know, like he just had to struggle with a lot of things that we continue to deal with at this very moment, you know. Let me ask you this. I think when we see the struggles that he had in Hollywood, trying to get his movies made, you know, trying to get cast. Was this something that you were able to relate to? I mean, as a director in this business, is this something that you were able to relate to as well?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're still having this conversation about diversity and inclusion
Mhm.
um, almost 50 years later. And I mean, that was one of the reasons I wanted to make the film, because we're having this conversation now, and it's hard enough for, you know, actors, actresses of color to make it in Hollywood. How did someone like Bruce Lee seemingly make it in Hollywood in the 1960s when, you know, the Vietnam War was just starting to boil up, the Korean War a decade earlier, and then 2 decades earlier was World War II, where the Japanese were interned and seen as the enemy by many Americans. And so the face of the Asian American, especially the Asian American male, was the face of the enemy. So having someone like Bruce Lee, an Asian American, be on screen and be successful, um, that's kind of an anomaly, and that's a story that I wanted to tell.
Mm. And then another part that was interesting as it relates to his journey and his struggle. Now, growing up, I'd watched Kung Fu, the TV series Kung Fu with David Carradine. It was in, again, it was sort of local affiliate reruns by the time I was watching it. I was probably like 10 or 11 years old. I always liked it. The rumor was that at that time, the rumor was that David Carradine was part Chinese. That was the rumor at that time. And I had no idea that Bruce had anything to do peripherally or otherwise with this movie. But then later on, I heard the rumor that he actually helped to develop the movie and he was a creator. Was that true?
I mean, there's a lot of speculation around each kind of story. It's without having Bruce here to like verify, it's hard to, there's conflicting accounts. So we kind of included both accounts in the film. So then there's like some neutrality. But it doesn't really change the fact that, the executives still didn't see Bruce Lee as a hero, or any Asian American playing the lead of this role. That is written, the character is Asian, but you're gonna whitewash it. Um, so it just shows you, like, again, going back to our boy, Jeff's line about America's, Hollywood's racist because America's racist. It's just like America wasn't ready for an Asian, and why weren't they ready? And it's just this cycle, right? Of like, what who's ready for it if we're not seeing it on screen, if it's not being reflected, and then society doesn't see it, so they don't think that we can be heroes. And
Right. Well, that was interesting because I think when I later on in life when I heard that he was being considered for the role, but then lost it to David Carradine. I just remember as a kid feeling so deflated about that. Like, wow, what could this have been? And David Carradine ate off that for years. I mean, you see him later in Quentin Tarantino movies with this still being like a martial arts guy. You know what I mean? So he carried that legacy forever. He benefited from that legacy of the TV show Kung Fu for the rest of his career. But I guess the thing that was so telling was there was the producer, the executive in there that said, not only could I not cast Bruce in the leading role for Kung Fu, I couldn't find any viable Asian actor to fill that leading role. I mean, that to me speaks to just the I don't know if you want to call it blatant racism or implicit bias that somebody could not even consider that an Asian American could play the role of a Chinese person. You know, um, that I thought was a really telling moment in the movie, in the doc. I mean, did that strike you, or did you feel some type of way when you heard a Hollywood producer speak that way?
I mean, I've heard it all in a way, so it didn't surprise me so much. I mean, something that did surprise me that we didn't really expand on in the film, but I'll give you a little exclusive here, is when they said like people wouldn't be ready for like Bruce's accent, even though his accent, like, it's like a British Hong Kong accent. It's like better than what I find American accents to be many times.
Yeah.
And you had someone like Desi Arnaz on I Love Lucy, who has a very thick accent,
Right.
and I Love Lucy is a very beloved show.
Totally.
It makes you think. I mean, to be somewhat diplomatic, his Cuban accent is used as kind of comic relief, but at the same time, I think Bruce, being Bruce, could have carried Kung Fu for sure. But you also think about the hypothetical: if he did Kung Fu, would he have done all those films in Hong Kong? Would Enter the Dragon have been made? And who knows? So it's you can kind of it goes both ways.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point. When you talk about Enter the Dragon, I remember at the end uh, of the at the end of the doc when they say how much the movie grossed, and it was the equivalent of 500 million, in today's dollars. I mean, that's $500 million. You would think that would turn the leading man of any movie into the biggest star on the fucking planet. You know what I mean? Who knows what that would have turned into for him, going forward. I mean, that's so amazing.
Yeah, and this is like the year where I believe The Godfather came out, and there's like it. That was a great year for cinema. So Enter the Dragon is like placed up there.
Right.
And I mean, you think about it too. Again, it's hypothetical. If like Bruce was, he would have been a huge star. Um, he would have been making more films, and he would have been making films that, going back to our early conversation, that were multifaceted, that wasn't just the kung fu action star, but was the leading man. Like, can you imagine like how much he would have like represented and advocated for like this idea of the Asian male, like masculine Asian male who could be like the boyfriend or the husband, and that because that would have been almost over 40 years ago, and we would have had that advocate for 40 years.
Right.
We would have been there would have been so much progress made, and we just had this void for decades, right? Um, and not to negate his role as a symbol. Obviously, we talked about the iconography and the myth of Bruce Lee and how important that is. But you always wonder what would have happened for our community for representation if he was around to be that voice.
Yeah, yeah, which was interesting. I mean, you're right. I mean, since his death, there wasn't a prominent. I mean, there wasn't a prominent Asian American leading man. I don't know if there still has been, since then. I'm just trying to think. I mean, of course, there's a lot more of us in TV and film than ever before, but I'm just trying to think if there's an Asian American man. See, now this point too,
It's a
because
poor distinction, yeah.
this is a big distinction because people say, well, what about Jackie Chan? Well, what about Jet Li? And I'm like, as great as they are, they're not Asian American. They weren't born here. They weren't citizens.
And they had to make it huge in China before they could like prove to Hollywood that they would be bankable here, right? They
Right.
they weren't seen for their potential. They had to like pay their dues, and I think that's an important thing with people of color. Like, we're not seen for our potential. We have to kind of earn so much more, like kind of our own currency before we're allowed to like try something that maybe another person might have, be seen as be given that opportunity.
100%. And I think, I have this conversation with a lot of our mutual friends in the business, and when you see big movies coming out now with Asians being cast, or you see TV shows or series that have longer than a one season run, or you see directors like yourself, you know, with every project, thank God it continues to grow. I get really excited, and this is just film and TV. I mean, we're not talking about music either, which we're seeing strides in as well. But I get really excited when I see this. I get really encouraged, and then a lot of my friends in the business are like, "Whoa, hold on, it's not quite sea change. We're getting there. We're making strides, but it's not quite." Because I get fucking excited. Like, I get here and I'm like, it's only a matter of time. Give it next 5-10 years, Daniel Day Kim will be the next James Bond. You know what I mean? Like, I think about these things, but I'm just an excitable person. You know what I mean? How do you see it? Like, with Bruce Lee as the touchstone, with Bruce Lee as the guy who was the catalyst and the impetus 4 years ago for these kinds of things. where do you see it in 5 years?
I mean, I hope like even though I love James Bond, like we need to make our own James Bond, right? We
Yeah.
our degree, our measure of success shouldn't be based on like
Mm.
this white adjacency complex, right? And that's the next step. We're still kind of I'm maybe being too progressive or just like reaching for the mountaintop, but I've been empowered by learning about Bruce's story. And
Mhm.
what I found too that's different from his struggle that we're repeating today, or that we don't have to repeat today, is that he didn't have like that community behind him. He felt like he was doing it alone for the most part. Like, he was teaching people like Steve McQueen and like James Coburn, but they didn't understand the struggle. They weren't lifting him up. And so
Right.
we have this community, this moment to galvanize as Asian American creators in music, in film, in TV, in books. And we see the moment. We have to like, uh, Gavin Newsom keeps on saying "meet the moment" every time he does a COVID press conference, and I just think it's like a really funny line. But
Yeah.
I understand why he uses it. But like, we have to meet the moment in many ways, and we have to start shaping our own stories and building our own worlds. There's this really great Vietnamese American poet named Ocean Vuong who talks about like, as people of color, as artists of color, we're always expected to like write memoir or like write something based on our story and experience.
Mhm.
Um, and I think we're like too entrusted to be like tour guides to like mainstream culture into our worlds, but we're not allowed to build new worlds. I think that's the next step that the community can take on and we can take on in terms of representations. Like we need to be seen as like craftspeople and artists that can just build something new and not have to just rehash our history because we have that ability.
I think that's a great point, and I think it just shines a light also, or it makes it very clear where we are at this moment in terms of in history, in showbiz history. We're sort of in that period where, we're sort of. I feel like we're kind of leaving that stage where we're shining, like you said, the stories that have been told previously in film and TV have been about our past. But I think that's a really great point that you make that um, as we go forward, it's going to be about us in the present, about who we are in the present. Because, I mean, who knows if for any community, cinema and TV and film really addresses where any group is in the present, except for maybe, okay, for white people, maybe, you know what I mean? But definitely not for us. And I think I can't wait for these stories to be told, and I'm just so excited and energized that because I understand that feeling that Bruce may have had of being out there on an island. You know what I mean? Like, and I understand that, and now I get excited when I hear about all the projects that people we know or people we don't know have in the works. It really makes me excited about our future in this business. And the fact that we have platforms like this where you and I can have very candid conversations without the machine about where we are and where we're going. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think it's a reckoning in many ways, and not just society, but in representation and the society that's seen on on our TV screen, and that society is important because we're many of us are still stuck at home, right? And the reflection, the interaction that we have with our neighbors, with our communities, with our individuals are absorbed through what we see on television, on film, through what we read at home. And then that's how we treat people later on sometimes. And it's not just about us being seen, it's about how other people see us,
Yeah.
right? See us, they can see us as a hero, they can see us as a romantic lead, they can see us as a villain. Like it's not just about positive portrayals, it's about being multifaceted.
I completely agree, man. And I think, I always go back to this quote that Chris Rock had. I'm not sure if you saw this, but he said, you know, he said that the I'm paraphrasing and I probably don't have this right, but what he was saying was something to the effect that, you know, you can tell that black people have made it in cinema when we can suck. You know what I mean? And I feel the same way about us. You know what I mean? It's like right now we can't fail. You know, like everything we do has to be a grand slam. You know, that's just sort of where we are at this point in history. You know, everything we do has to be Haley's Comet, basically. You know what I mean? And I'm, you know, that we will have made it when we get to the point where we don't necessarily we can strike out a couple times. You know what I mean? Or we can be full.
I mean, our parents won't let us strike out, but it's you know, society gives us that opportunity for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. You know, the other thing that I thought was really great stylistically about Be Water, and you touched on it on Instagram, is, you know, most documentaries, particularly in this era, it's just like this endless parade of talking heads, you know, speaking on whatever the subject is of the documentary. And I thought that it was much more poetic and artistically it was, and aesthetically it was so much more pleasing for me to watch a documentary where the images were strictly about the subject, you know, and you heard the narration, you heard the voices, you heard Jeff Chang, you heard Kareem, you know, you heard Linda, but what you were looking at visually was the material, you know. um can you talk to me about stylistically that decision to present it that way?
I mean, it was like a decision I made pretty early on in the process of making the film because I wanted, again, the film is about like unpacking the mythology of Bruce Lee. It's not talking about his impact after he died or his legacy. It's talking about him as a human being and to be immersed in the time that he was living, you know, 1950s Hong Kong, 1960s America, back to 1970s Hong Kong. And what that meant was never cutting back to like our present time, like 2020, where you see someone in their 70s, 80s talking about a 20, 30-year-old Bruce Lee.
Right.
You know, that's a bit jarring as a viewer. And so I wanted to fully immerse the audience into, again, Bruce's present moment through what he saw, what he felt, what he's, you know, heard. And yeah, I think for me, it's a more cinematic experience in many ways. It's a more immersive experience when you're building that world.
I mean, and if you think about it, all that time that people spend in other documentaries focused on the commentators, that takes away time from the actual material. And like, I just wonder, you know, would I have seen footage of his office, you know, and the lady that's like cleaning out his office, and you see the awesome tiger photo on the, or the painting on the wall, she's taking it down, or you see the crazy wallpaper with the, you know, with all the naked white women, you know, on the wallpaper and everything, you know, like these are all really important subtleties, in my opinion, an insight into who he was and his taste and his aesthetic. It just kind of gives you more of an idea of who he was. Um, and I thought that was really awesome that we didn't have anything to distract from seeing those visual images, you know.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's again, it's. I mean, I love all types of documentaries that include talking head,
Mm.
but again, it's like we have to place ourselves in the mind, the point of view of Bruce Lee as much as we can. And I think there's, you know, when we do see people at the very end, there's like a poignancy, right? We see them and how they're connected with Bruce. We see photos of them and Bruce, and then we see them today in their age, current age, like they're like their late 70s or 80s, And I feel like when I watch it, I kind of think like, what would Bruce look like as a contemporary? What would he look like? He would have turned 80 this year, and so you just kind of imagine that. And I think there's more like a reasoning behind showing it at the end for me than just kind of sprinkling it throughout the film for no reason.
Yeah, and I thought that the choice to focus on his life as it was at that time, in that time period, and not sort of the mythology, the conspiracy theories, like you said on Instagram, not focus on Brandon and the unfortunate tragedy there, or all the other, like I said, all the theories that swirled around, as it related to his death. But it's interesting. We have this sort of preoccupation, I think, with icons that die early. He's sort of in that. It kind of puts him in that pantheon of like Bob Marley or Jimi Hendrix, or I mean, you name it. All these people in pop culture that died very young. And it gives us too much freedom to kind of think about uh, who they might have been, or who we think they are, as opposed to being able to focus on what his life really was, at that time.
For sure. And I think that's, you think about his impact if he's alive or he passed away and was immortalized. And it's a hard question to answer because you don't know. And obviously, he's had such a great impact by his early death and in a way, his immortalization. So,
I think, in closing, one of the most inspiring things that I got moving forward, that I feel like I can implement in my own life, was just this sense of fortitude, is his unwillingness to give up, you know, as the title suggests, be water, just and like we discussed, the fluidity with which he approached everything, and then his inclusiveness, his idea of inclusiveness, and I think those three things, as takeaways for me. I don't see how you can fail in life. You know what I mean? If you embody those things, and clearly in death, as we see with Bruce, you know, um, and I don't think I've gotten that from any other doc I've seen on him, or anything else that I've read, So I think he really did a beautiful job of pulling that off, man. Just having that come through.
thank you so much. Yeah.
No doubt, man. Well, thank you, Bao. I really appreciate it. Thank you for doing this with me, man. And I really want everybody to do this. Be Water, documentary on Bruce Lee. It's on ESPN Plus right now. Bao Nguyen, really appreciate you doing it, man. Mobile homies.
Thank you so much, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Have a good one.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thanks for everyone who watched.
Yeah.